Club Candy. Chapter 5. The Heist. The night of the heist, the air was thick and starless, the moon a pale, hazy smudge behind a veil of city smog. Joe Reynolds stood on the corner of Marietta and Parker, feeling as conspicuous as a scarecrow in an empty field. The street was deserted, the warehouses around him dark and silent, their windows like vacant eyes. He lit a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. The flare of the match a brief, startling intrusion in the gloom. The smoke, harsh and acrid in his throat, did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart. This was a world he did not belong to. His world was one of daylight and hard labor, of coming home to the smell of cornbread and the sound of his children's laughter. This world of shadows and secrets, whispered plans and stolen goods, felt like a betrayal of everything he was. But the memory of Sal Marcone's words, the image of his children's wanting faces, had been a stronger pull than the voice of his own conscience. He had told Eleanor he was working a late shift, a lie that had felt like a stone in his mouth. She had looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, knowing sadness that he could not meet. She knew he was lying, but she did not challenge him. She simply packed him a small parcel of leftover chicken and biscuits, a silent act of love and faith that made his deception feel all the more wretched. He took another drag from his cigarette, the glowing tip a tiny, lonely star in the darkness. He was just a man having a smoke. That's what Sal had said. An innocent bystander. But he felt far from innocent. He felt like a conspirator, a participant in a crime that was unfolding somewhere in the shadows around him. He could feel the tension in the air, a low, electric hum of anticipation. He heard the truck before he saw it, the low rumble of its engine a growing threat in the stillness. It emerged from the darkness of the warehouse district, its headlights cutting a swath through the gloom. It was moving slowly, cautiously. As it approached his corner, a long black car, its own lights off, pulled out from a side street, blocking the truck's path. Joe's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. He saw two figures emerge from the car, their movements swift and purposeful. They went to the driver's side of the truck, and though he could not hear their words, he could see the menace in their posture. The truck door opened, and the driver, a silhouette against the dim light of the cab, got out, his hands raised in surrender. It was happening so fast. One of the men from the car climbed into the truck, while the other motioned for the driver to get into the black car. The whole scene was a silent, terrifying ballet of crime, a choreography of fear and intimidation. Joe felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of terror and a strange, detached fascination. He was a part of this. His silence, his presence on this corner, was his contribution to this act of theft. Then he saw it. The distant, rhythmic flash of blue and red light, painting the dark buildings with fleeting strokes of color. A patrol car. It was still several blocks away, but it was coming. His heart leaped into his throat. This was his role. This was his one simple task. He dropped his cigarette to the pavement, the small, glowing ember a beacon of his fear. He ground it out with the sole of his shoe, the movement clumsy, frantic. He turned his back to the street, his body rigid, every muscle tensed for the sound of the siren, the squeal of tires, the shout of a policeman. But the carmen had seen it too. With a final swift movement, they pushed the truck driver into their car. The vehicle sped off into the darkness, its engine a fading roar. The hijacked truck, now driven by one of Sal's men, turned sharply down a side street, its own engine gunning, and disappeared. Joe leaned against the brick wall of the warehouse, his legs weak, his body slick with a cold sweat. The silence that descended in the wake of the patrol car was more profound, more unnerving than the noise that had preceded it. He was alone again, just a man on a corner in the dead of night. But he was not the same man who had arrived here an hour ago. He had stepped over a line, and he knew with a chilling certainty that he could never go back. He had traded a piece of his soul for a handful of dollars, and the weight of that bargain settled upon him, heavier than any crate he had ever lifted. The taste of the cigarette smoke in his mouth had turned to ash. The heist was over, But Joe Reynolds' part in it, the part that would play out in the quiet, dark corners of his own conscience, had just begun. The next day at the docks was a special kind of hell. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sideways glance a silent accusation. Joe worked in a fog of anxiety, his body moving through the familiar rhythms of labor while his mind replayed the events of the previous night in a relentless, tormenting loop. He felt marked, exposed, as if his complicity were a brand on his forehead for all to see. He avoided the other workers, eating his lunch alone, the taste of Eleanor's chicken and biscuits turning to sawdust in his mouth. He waited all day for Sal to appear, anticipating with a tight, cold knot in his stomach. But the man was nowhere to be seen. The workday ended, and Joe walked home with his burden of unrewarded crime heavy on his shoulders. The promised real money felt as ephemeral as the smoke from his cigarette on the corner. It was 2 days later when Sal finally cornered him. He found Joe by the water, at the far end of the pier, where the river lapped against the decaying pylons. Sal had 2 of his men with him, hulking figures who stood a few feet back, their presence a casual, unspoken threat. "Reynolds," Sal said, a wide, false smile stretching across his face. "My man of the hour. You did good the other night. Real good. Like I said, a smart man." Joe's heart began to pound. This was it, the payment. He thought of the money, the crisp bills that would make the risk, the fear, the shame, all worthwhile. He imagined handing it to Eleanor, seeing the relief in her eyes, being, for once, the provider he so desperately wanted to be. "Got your payment right here," Sal said, gesturing with his head toward a stack of large cardboard boxes piled nearby. "A little something for your trouble." Joe looked at the boxes, his brow furrowed in confusion. There were at least a dozen, sealed with packing tape. "What's this?" he asked, a flicker of unease beginning to extinguish the flame of his hope. Sal's smile widened, and this time, Joe could see the cruelty in it. "That, my friend, is your cut. The finest candy money can buy. Chocolates, caramels, lollipops. The works. The truck was full of it. A goddamn candy store on wheels." He and his men laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed over the water. The sound hit Joe like a physical blow. Candy. His payment was candy. "I don't understand," Joe said, his voice barely a whisper. You said money." "And I'm a man of my word," Sal said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "This stuff is worth a fortune. You got kids, right? 6 of them? Hell, they'll think you're a king. Merry Christmas in July, courtesy of Sal Marcone." He clapped Joe on the shoulder again, the gesture now feeling like a mockery, a public assertion of his dominance. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave that rose from Joe's stomach to his throat. He had been played for a fool. He had risked his freedom, his family's security, his own soul, for a pile of stolen sweets. Sal hadn't seen him as a partner, not even as a low-level conspirator. He had seen him as a joke, a poor, desperate black man who could be bought for nothing, whose needs were so trivial they could be paid off with children's treats. The anger came then, a surge of white-hot rage that was so powerful it made him dizzy. He wanted to lash out, to smash Sal's smiling, mocking face, to make him feel a fraction of the degradation that was coursing through his own veins. He balled his hands into fists, his knuckles white, his body trembling with the effort of holding back a lifetime of suppressed fury. But he was trapped. Sal's men had shifted their weight, their hands moving inside their jackets. They were waiting, almost hoping, for him to make a move. And Joe, in that moment of blinding rage, saw with perfect clarity the futility of it all. He was one man, and they were a machine that would grind him up and spit him out without a second thought. He had a wife. He had 6 children. He could not afford the luxury of his anger. He forced his hands to unclench. He let the rage recede, banking it like a fire, though he knew its embers would smolder within him for a long, long time. He looked at the boxes, then back at Sal, his face now a blank, impenetrable mask. "Thank you, Mr. Marcone," he said, the words tasting like poison. "You're too generous." Sal's smile faltered for a second, thrown off by Joe's sudden, chilling composure. He had expected anger, pleading, a satisfying display of impotent fury. This quiet, cold dignity was unsettling. He shrugged, regaining his swagger. "Don't mention it, Reynolds. We take care of our friends." He and his men walked away, their laughter carrying back on the salty air. Joe was left alone on the pier, with the river and the sky and the dozen boxes of candy that represented the sum of his moral compromise. He felt a profound, soul-crushing defeat. He had gambled and lost, not just the money, but a piece of himself. He had no idea how he was going to face Eleanor. How could he bring home this mountain of candy, this monument to his own foolishness, and look his wife in the eye? He was not a king. He was a fool. And as he stood there, the weight of the bitter payment settled upon him, a burden far heavier than any he had ever carried. End of Chapter 5. Next episode, Chapter 6, The Candy Mountain.